I'd like to talk with you about a topic I titled, How to Deal with Loneliness. Over the past several weeks, I've been focusing on a series titled, Renewing Your Mind. Would the quality of your life improve if you learned how to better deal with loneliness? In fact, if you have your Bibles, click open to Matthew chapter 11. We'll spend some time there. Did you know that America is facing a huge epidemic of loneliness? This is not the ordinary loneliness that every one of us feels every now and again. I'm talking about the epidemic has to deal with regularly feeling lonely, a deep sense of emotional disconnectedness. Research shows that 36% of Americans suffer from chronic loneliness. And approximately 43% of our seniors experience severe loneliness. I'm talking about true isolation. The epidemic is most severe among the young adults, with 61% of young adults say they suffer from loneliness and inability to connect with others. Before I delve into what the Bible has to say on this very important topic, I want us to have a broader perspective of this problem of loneliness. The loneliness epidemic impacts our health in significant ways. There's a 30% increased risk in early death. In other words, we human beings, we're not designed to live isolated lives of loneliness. Research shows that severe loneliness impacts your health in an equivalent way like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And there are 20 cigarettes in a pack. You are 64% more likely of developing dementia because of loneliness. And one of the most surprising things is that 92% of people find it difficult to tell others they're suffering from chronic loneliness. We're deathly afraid to tell others, I'm lonely. I love what Dr. Stephanie Cacioppo, who is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral neuroscience at the University of Chicago, says. The misery and suffering caused by chronic loneliness are very real and warrant attention. As a social species, we're accountable to help our lonely children, parents, neighbors, and even strangers in the same way we would treat ourselves. Treating loneliness is our collective responsibility. So I wanted to frame the discussion around some of the research findings so you can see how this loneliness issue is a really, really tough and widespread problem. And it's even more exacerbated now that we're in this challenge of COVID. How do you deal with loneliness? Jesus weighs in the conversation, and he says in Matthew 11, verse 28, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." I want you to envision Jesus speaking in front of thousands. And yet, the problem of loneliness hits us in isolation. And there he is, dealing with this thorny, tough problem of loneliness. But he says to them what scholars call it's the great invitation. Come to me. And that word come, it's in the present imperative tense. Not to be overly technical, but I want you to see I didn't buy my degrees. It means come and keep on coming. Never stop coming to me when you're weary, tired, burdened, overwhelmed. Then he says, take my yoke upon you. A yoke was this wooden implement. It's shaped, in the middle it's flat. On the outer sides it's curved. On the bottom it's flat. Outer sides it's curved. The heads or the necks of 2 oxen would go into the yoke, and then we snap shut so they can plow a field. There's no doubt Jesus, as a carpenter, must have even built some yokes. But then he uses this language. He says, take my yoke upon you. It's voluntary. It's individual. My yoke is my message, my manner of living in terms of values. What's his message? Love God. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. And so he says, take my yoke. What were the people? What yokes did they have? They had the yoke of the bondage of the law. Do this, don't do that. Do that, don't do this. And they had the bondage of the Roman taxation. And so these people were just overwhelmed and burdened. And on top of that, the mental health issue of isolation and loneliness. And Jesus says, look, take my yoke upon you. You're burdened. You're weary. Take my yoke upon you. It'll change how you deal with loneliness so you can be able to properly handle it, even in the face of COVID. Let me delve deeper. How do we deal with loneliness? You must take notice. Of what? Take notice that there's a difference between being lonely and being alone. Many individuals mix it up. And when you mix it up, it exacerbates a problem or creates a problem that was never there. Mark 1 verse 35, it says, very early the next morning before daylight, Jesus got up and went to a place where he could be alone and pray. I mean, he tiptoed through the house. People were asleep. He circumvented them. Didn't want to wake them up. Didn't want to disturb their rest. When he opened the door, he made sure it didn't shut loudly or slam. He walked out of the house gingerly and then walked perhaps in the yard to find a place where he could be alone. So Jesus was demonstrating by his very actions that being alone is not bad. That there's something good about you being able to be alone with God, to commune with God, to reflect on your thoughts, your feelings, to be able to process even the idea that God has a plan for your life and to contemplate that. See, the contemplative life is not to be shunned or dismissed as something that is a life that is bad. Jesus had alone time with God to pray, to fellowship, to connect. He enjoyed being with himself. I want you to find the answer to this question. Do you enjoy you? Because if you don't enjoy you, and you're single and when you get married, it's going to be tough for you to enjoy your spouse if you are not at peace with you. It's almost like kids. You know how little kids are. They get angry at you and come and tell you, I'm bored, as if you're their entertainment. And so now all of a sudden they put on you this responsibility. Entertain me. You have a problem that I'm bored. Lindsey Vonn is the world's most decorated skier. To her credit, her 82 World Cup wins, 3 Olympic medals, and 20 World Cup titles. As a former professional skier and swimsuit model, she's wealthy, famous, attractive, popular. I mean, she has a lot going for herself. Yet she suffers from depression and struggles with loneliness. In a recent interview with People magazine, she opens up and tells us, after the races ended, I'd go back to my empty hotel room and the silence would be deafening. I always felt that being alone was the hardest part for me. Somehow, in her mind, she mixed the two. Being alone, she thinks, was being equivalent to being lonely. Not minimizing her struggle with loneliness. I'm saying that it becomes exacerbated when you don't separate and recognize there's a huge distinction between being lonely versus being alone. What's the difference, you may ask? Being lonely is an emotional state, which has to do with your interior thought life. Being alone is a physical state, which has to do with your exterior reality. Being lonely is a lack of human connection. Being alone is a lack of human company. There's no one around. Being lonely describes this gnawing feeling. It has to do with being unsettled or anxious. Being alone describes a setting. It has to do with your physical surroundings. In order to overcome loneliness, you must take notice that there's a huge distinction between being lonely and being alone. Being lonely describes the feeling that something is missing. I'm incomplete. Being alone says nothing is missing. I'm not struggling with feeling incomplete. I want you to see that there's a huge distinction between being lonely and being alone. And you must take notice of that, because that'll certainly help us deal with loneliness if we struggle with it. I remember years ago, I was in grad school, and I had some time between classes, and I wanted to get a bite to eat, so I jumped in my car, I drove to a nearby restaurant, and I was by myself, and so when I got there, it was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's not the greatest time in the world for lunch or dinner. It's a weird time, but I was hungry. And so since I was going to be eating by myself, I figured, let me just pass the time away. Since I have no table fellowship, no one to talk with, let me just read. So I took one of those folders, those file folders, those manila-colored folders. And I had some papers in it. I had my pen. And when I went into the restaurant, I sat down. The place was about 80% empty. I'm sitting there, opened up my file folder, and I start writing. The waitress came over and asked me what my order was. I gave her my order. She went to tell the chef, and they're preparing the meal. But then every few moments as I'm writing and reading, I look up and look around, and I write and I look up. In a few moments, the waitress came over to me. She said, "Sir, are you a food critic?" I said, I'm not a food critic. And she didn't believe me. So next thing I knew, that all these sumptuous meals are coming. And said, "This is on the house. Try this. Try that." And so I got all this stuff-free food. I walked out of them. He had to roll me out of there. I didn't have to pay for the thing because they thought I was a food critic. See, they struggled that, well, this guy's alone. He's writing his manila folder. He must be a food critic. Now, I criticize food, but I'm not a food critic. We have to see there's a big difference between being lonely and being alone. We must also, to deal with loneliness, we must take action. I know there's a difference between being lonely and being alone, and I don't want to trivialize real loneliness. I don't want to minimize it. If you're struggling with that, I don't want you to walk out of here hearing dribble and feeling as if, man, he mishandled that. I was looking for answers. So I'm very sympathetic about your loneliness. And I do want you to be mindful that even some of the greatest saints in Scripture struggled with loneliness. David, the psalmist, and second king of Israel, struggled with it. In Psalm 25, verse 16, listen to what he sings. "Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I'm lonely and afflicted." He describes his loneliness with the word afflicted. I hurt. I experience pain. In other words, what David was describing was a kind of loneliness. It's not the run-of-the-mill. It's not the normative loneliness that we all feel every now and again. It's what's referred to as chronic loneliness. You may say, what's chronic loneliness? Chronic loneliness is the inability to connect on an emotional level with others. And sometimes people who are in senior level positions, business owners, CEOs, managers of large departments, they struggle with chronic loneliness if they don't have a social circle where they can connect with. Why do they struggle with it? Because the problems they face are different than the problems that the average person faces. The decisions they have to make are more involved. The financial decisions they have to make are, bigger numbers and bigger pressures and larger level of stress. And I know for me, I pastor a church of 10,000 people. And so when you deal with all active members of our church, both campuses, and so if I didn't have a small circle of friends that I can talk to, and no one needs counseling, they just want to talk, we just want to hang out, drink a cup of coffee together. If I didn't have that, I can see how chronic loneliness would be my lot. Chronic loneliness means you need or you don't have a close friend. See, there's no confidant. There's no amigo, no caro amico, if you're Italian. You need to have confidants, close friends. Chronic loneliness is believing no one gets me. I'm not heard or understood on a deep level. Chronic loneliness is feeling isolated relationally and emotionally. See, chronic loneliness results in you feeling that you're lacking self-worth. How come they don't want to hang out with me? I must not be of any value. Here's the most frightening trait of chronic loneliness. It's defined as you're being tired of trying to engage. I reached out to Paul. I reached out to Mary. No response. I reached out to Susan. I haven't heard from her in weeks. I sent a text to Fred. And after a while, you say, I'm just tired of trying to engage without any reciprocation. That's what David said he was feeling. The action he took was that he sought God in prayer. Now, don't minimize the value of prayer. See, prayer is seen as the soul rising from the earth to fellowship with God in heaven. Consider this. Prayer is seen as you climbing Jacob's ladder to get to commune with God, and you left the junk at the foot of the ladder. Prayer is seen as you hopping a ride on Elijah's chariot, and your worries about loneliness couldn't fit in the chariot, so you commune with God. But let me ask you this question that you need to ask yourself. What am I doing to encourage loneliness in my life? Is there something you're doing that you're not aware of? Is there something that you're projecting that reinforces your loneliness? In other words, are you building bridges or are you building barriers? See, a bridge then you build in order to escape the hole of loneliness is when you are able to ask people questions to engage in relationships. How's your mom? What's going on with your son? I heard he applied to college. What school is he going to go to? Hey, tell me what's happening on your job. What's the new thing you're working on now? See, those are bridge-building questions. Barriers is when the conversation is all about you. Let me tell you what I'm doing on my job right now. Let me tell you about my mom. My kid applied to 3 colleges. Let me tell you the ones he got into. Let me tell you what I want to do now. If it's all about you, that's not a bridge. That's a barrier. Do you know why the percentage of loneliness is so severe among young adults? 61% struggle with it. The biggest reason is social media. Facebook friends are not real friends. Your Instagram followers, they're not followers. Those are virtual friends. They're not real friends. In fact, I love academic studies. One study I read, and it's affirmed by so many other studies, that if you go to dinner and you're sitting at the restaurant, you pull out your cell phone, you put it on the table, the percentage drops significantly for you to connect relationally with the people that you're eating with. Why? You're always distracted thinking you're going to get another opportunity on the phone, a better opportunity, a preferred group, something else that may come up. And as a result, you're not all in the social interaction and exchange that takes place at the table. See, the cell phone thing, if you're not mindful, and the social media thing could be a blessing or a curse. And so you think you're building bridges, but you're building barriers. And so you need to then say, what do I do? And I know if you're so slick, what happens if you're a medical doctor? You're not a medical doctor. What happens if there's an emergency with a kid? You got no kid. You know, what am I saying? What I'm saying is that you need to stop finding a reason to reinforce your isolation because there's not an emergency going on. I remember when my children were small, and then I would go and have a dinner or maybe a lunch with other pastors, and they're on their phone all the time. Our church at the time was like 5,000 people. They're dealing with 100 people. I get no phone calls. I get no texts. They're on the phone, and I said, what are you doing? I said, the only person who's giving me a text is, or back then it wasn't even text, the only person who's calling me is Jessica. And Jessica's like, my daughter is 6 years old. She's like, Daddy, I'm watching this show, and she's trying to describe the show to me. I said, I don't get a call. Because when you develop your staff to say, function without me. Let me describe to you what an emergency is. See, sometimes we never tell people. Some people send you emails with a red exclamation mark. I said, don't send me that anymore. I said, here's why. They said, why not? It's an emergency. I said, it's not an emergency. I said, you know how many people I buried this past month? You have no emergency. Take that red exclamation mark off that email. Don't send that to me. That's for the next guy. Some people, you have to teach your children and teach your sphere of friends. So when you sit down at the meal, you're all in. So take action. Being alone, it leads to health challenges. I should say, being alone doesn't create health challenges. Being lonely does. What action did David take beyond the idea of prayer? I'm glad you asked. Psalm 68 verse 6 tells us what David did. David says, you, referencing God, you find families for those who are lonely. David was able to find a community, a small cadre of people that he can connect with relationally, people like Jonathan in his life, others, Samuel was one of his confidants, people that you have a circle of friends. You don't need 6 million Facebook friends. You're lonely, you get on there and you tell everybody I'm lonely. Then I'm going away because I'm lonely. Then the Facebook friends break into your house because you're away. I mean, the idea is that you got to understand that stop making me laugh. I mean, God says he finds families for those who are lonely. So one of the actions David was able to take is say, God, you said, you promised me a family, a group, a community where I won't be able to live a lonely life, but we can connect and do life together. That's why our church has over 100 small groups. And they're different types. Some are discussion-based, centered around the Bible. Some are activity-based. Some are stage of life-based. Some are for teenagers. Some are for married people. You're married? Go there. You're single? Go there. You're a teenager? Go there. We even have a group that's for senior citizens called Joy. Joy? Yeah, just an older you. And so it's just, you got to be able to, you have seasons of life, so you have to go out of your way so you can be able to connect. Because God says, I promise you, if you're lonely, I'll put you into a family. I love what Gretchen Rubin, who's an author and a blogger, what she says. Keep in mind that to avoid loneliness, many people need both a social circle and an intimate attachment. Having just one of two may still leave you feeling lonely. See, it's not good enough just to show up to a small group. You got to open up. If nobody knows who you are, and you don't let people into the inner part of your world, then you don't feel a sense of emotional connection. And so what we learned already in terms of dealing with loneliness is you have to take notice. Being lonely and being alone are different. Take action, prayer, connecting in a small group. It helps to remove that sense of isolation. But what we also learn is that we have to take comfort. Since God, our Creator, He's our Creator, He's very sympathetic of our mental health and our emotional needs. David weighs in and brings out that point in Psalm 142, verse 4. He says, "Look and see, there's no one at my right hand. No one is concerned for me. I have no refuge. No one cares for my life. I cry to you, Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living." What is David saying? Scholars agree that at this stage in David's life, he was in the cave of Adullam, hiding out because Saul, the king, was trying to kill him. And David used the language, there was no one on my right hand. That language, in terms of the cultural meaning of it in Jewish thought, is that champions stay on your right side, your right hand. David said, I'm going through, and there is no champion that would help give me confidence and bolster up my courage. And so he says, God, there's no one on my right, and so I turn to you for refuge. So David's taking comfort not in wallowing in the quagmire of self-pity. It's easy to experience self-pity. It's easy to wallow around with this negativity and this pessimism. It's a way you drive people away. Nobody wants to be around people that's, man, it's such a bad day. It's blue out here. It's dark. I'm dying. It's just, man, it's bad. Who wants to hang out with someone like that? You want to spend time with me? No. Why not? I'll leave depressed. And you can't be weird, because I'm lonely. Would you be my friend? I remember I was in grad school. I was 20 years old at the time. And this guy comes up to me, and I've known him. We have classes together. And he says, hey, Dave, will you be my friend? I mean, you don't ask someone to be your friend when you're an adult. That's like pre-K. And so he was so blunt, saying, would you be my friend? I was equally blunt. I'm from New York. That's all I know, blunt. And so I said, no. I mean, I'm not going to be a friend. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You understand when someone talks to you and use preschool or pre-K language. I mean, when my youngest daughter, Jessica, she was in pre-K, man, I hated to pick up Jessica from pre-K. Not that I didn't want to spend time with her, but because of what I had to go through to get her. You have to go into the classroom. When you go into the classroom, the teacher would talk to you as you were a pre-K child. And she would wave at me. She said, hi, Mr. Ireland. And she'd just move her hand. Man, I hated it. Then the kids, all of them would say, hi, Mr. Ireland. And so, I mean, it got to a point, so you can see, I'm in a 12-step recovery program out of the whole thing. I mean, it's just, and so when it got to the point where I said to Jessica, from now on, when I pick you up, and I'm whispering it now, I don't know why I'm whispering it to her. I said, Jessica, from now on, when I pick you up, I'm just going to poke my head in the classroom. And when you see a hand go like this, that's me. Because I don't want to hear, hi, Mr. I just want to hear that. We have to recognize that it's weird. So how do you take comfort? David is telling us he took comfort because he recognized God is concerned about him. And he didn't let self-pity become his reactive response to loneliness. And so he took comfort in the fact that God's there. And I want you to realize God cares for you, and he steps into your place of loneliness if you let him, to drive away the darkness of loneliness. Isaiah joins the conversation of how God comforts us. In Isaiah 43, verse 2, he says, When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. What is Isaiah saying? Isaiah was referred to as a singing prophet. He's saying to you, when you go through difficulties, water, flood, fire, take comfort that God doesn't abandon you. That includes loneliness. Ask God to help you sense His presence. Ask Him to show up in your silence. Paul was even more direct about how he gains comfort during bouts of loneliness. In 2 Timothy 4, verse 16, Paul says, "At my first defense, no one came to my support, but everyone deserted me. May it not be held against them. But the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. And I was delivered from the lion's mouth." Paul is not spiritualizing the idea of God giving him strength. You may say, well, how does God give strength to combat loneliness? He gives strength by letting you discover the exciting purpose as to why you've been created. What I've noticed is when people are clear on their assignment in life, they don't have time to be distracted by loneliness because they're so fired up about what God's calling them to do with their life. That's God giving you strength. When God gives you strength, it's when you sense His nearness in your life. And so when you're saying, like Paul says, God sensed His presence was there. He gave me strength by His abiding presence. That's God giving you strength when He tells you and nudges you, share your faith with that person. That's God guiding you and prompting you to say, I'm with you. Tell that person about me. Talk to that person about who I am. I want you to see how important that is. Have you ever heard of Brian Philip Welch, the co-founder and former guitarist of the heavy metal group KORN? In the video campaign titled I Am Second, he shares his conversion story that took place in 2012. See, Brian used to be addicted to drugs and alcohol, and he was involved in orgies and all kinds of aberrant sexual behavior. But here's what Brian said. You travel to get to another town. You play a show, and you do it again. You try to just be at peace, but even a big, huge band like KORN playing in front of thousands of people, it can get lonely. You can't connect with people except for the ones that you're with, because the ones you party with after the show, you don't know them. And then you're gone. Brian was so far away from God. God was nowhere on his radar. And it was one day a realtor was trying to show him property, said to him, this may sound weird to you, but I just had this verse on my heart for you for a while. Matthew 11, verse 28. Brian looked it up and started to study the meaning of the word. And you know the verse, it says, come to me all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest, Jesus said. Brian went to church with a realtor. Shortly thereafter, he came to know Christ. In essence, Matthew 11:28 tells us that Jesus called and Brian came. And he gave his life to Christ and was shortly water baptized. Why? He heard the great invitation from the great Savior. Come to me, all you who are burdened, and I'll give you rest. Even rest from chronic loneliness. If God can do that for Brian Philip Welch, hey, God can do that for anybody. I don't know who you have in your family that seems so far removed from God's love, but I'm here to remind you, we serve a God that thrives in working miracles. What a God that we serve. What a God that we serve. And I want to pray with you today about God filling the emptiness of your life and heart if you're someone who struggles with chronic loneliness.